Okay, so I've been thinking a little bit more about this issue of agency and how it relates to language and some of the problems of the hard line determinist position. And even if it is the case that that no one really holds that position, I don't know if anyone really holds the idea that people are completely radically free either. I think most of the people who are Christians that I know, I mean, and I do know a fair number of Christians, the bulk of their position on freedom is that it's a really complicated thing. It's their notion of freedom is that the person is fallen from grace and is a sinner, and they almost need to have a kind of morality beaten into them in order to enable them to find and exercise this kind of Christian morality. So I don't think that there is a belief that in the Christian view that you're born free. If anything, you're born enslaved to a kind of sinning that can be brought out of you. And so I don't even want to get into any of that. I think all that's ridiculous. Okay, so what I would rather do is get into this question of what is agency, how does it relate to language use, and how was it evolved from various forms of communication technology. And I think part of the concern is how easily people can deceive themselves. I think that's really, I think maybe part of it. And that's maybe partly why to bring up some of the more dogmatic religious positions is that I think you find self-deception in the religious views so often, but you can often find them, or just as likely find them, in some scientific accounts, especially some that move toward something like hardline determinism. Now, I think the point would be that there seems to be something like self-interest, and a person can grow in awareness of what is in their self-interest. Now, part of the problem is what self-interest is. How narrowly is it defined in terms of what resources and, what is meant by self, and then you start to get at, what are the boundaries of self, and then how will you define self-interest. But I think the general point is that a person can come to realize as they, are. And part of the problem has to do with age. Maybe this is the way to come at it, is that I think when you're really, really young, we'll say at infancy, you don't even know that you're there, I guess. And at a certain point, you'll say that you come to realize that you're there, but you have very narrowly defined notions of self-interest. And it may take years and years of growth and development and maybe other people's help for you to grow into different senses of self-interest. I try to take just simply, when you're young, you may want to eat candy, and your parents say, no, you're going to eat your vegetables, and they force you to redefine your self-interests because they realize that you're going to go from candy to bellyache, from candy to bellyache to diabetes, and they're saying, look, you're going to become aware later on that you have this thing called the self, and you're going to be glad that your interests were served. And you start to realize that when you take an action and your action shuts down future possibilities, it's very different than when you take an action and that action opens up possibilities. And you want to help some person become aware of to what extent are they closing down or opening up possibilities by every selection they make, sort of from here on out. And I think part of the problem is that we come to self-awareness in a thrown way. I mean, it's what Martin Heidegger calls thrownness, right? That we emerge to self-consciousness only after having already begun. That is, we're implicated in a set of socio-historical practices. We're implicated in a set of habits, a set of orientations. By the time we come to reflectively think about them, by the time we analyze them, they're already embedded in us, and we're entrenched in perpetuating them and all this kind of stuff. Okay, and that's partly why there's a need for a psychoanalysis there, because I think people can easily deceive themselves as they try to account for this. Uh, and just think about the way I've noticed this recently, that people have a way to, I guess, give themselves a license for sloth while simultaneously taking an air of self-righteousness about it, and they don't realize what they're doing. So you see it in the the professor who wants to give this self-righteous argument about how the proper pedagogy is to make sure that every person gets an A or something like this. Like, I've heard people give this, this is the proper pedagogy, and it seems more like it's a license for sloth masquerading as this is the way that you do the continuous learning model that Princeton's now advocating, blah blah blah. They're giving this kind of stuff. And it's similar to students who I think want to say, well, I want to think for myself. I'm not going to sit around and read books and get ideas from other people. I'm coming up with my own ideas. And you think, oh boy, what a convenient way to both be really lazy and to have like a self-righteous attitude about it to boot. Man, that's really amazing. I think that phenomena of finding ways of accounting for one's sloth, one's way to still gain while doing little, and to call it, hey, look, this is the way it's supposed to be done, or something like this, I think is really interesting. Okay, but these are all related to this question of, is that really in your best self-interest? And, well, who's to say what your own best self-interest is? Well, I think you are, but to what extent are you dependent upon others initially to help you, I guess, define those? I mean, take literacy. I mean, most children, they may be, well, we'll say it this way, that all children spontaneously learn language. They just do, without any formal instruction. They're there, and people talk with them, and they respond. And unless there's a physical deficit or something wrong, the children spontaneously speak the language that those around them speak. But literacy can be a struggle, that not only can you sort of force some kids into becoming literate, and some begrudgingly don't want it. Some, they won't see it in their immediate self-interest. They'll say, why do I need to learn spelling? Spelling seems really stupid. It seems like, what a waste of time. Why do I have to learn to spell these words? And, for certain people, depending upon their life circumstances, it seems far removed from the everyday give and take of their existence. So I think, in those cases, yeah, the parent says, look, you'll understand later that when you are literate, there will be more opportunities for you. Okay, so I mean, I think, so the point is that a person has to have a certain level of competency in order to be enough self-aware of how there is a self beyond the immediate one. That the more that one can realize the implication of long-term actions, or of actions in the long term, if we start to say, well, how will what I do impact a future me? Now, that can be estranged if you start to live for some self other than who you really are in the now. I mean, there's all this kind of stuff, but I think the point would be that you can have people who are damaged, who if they're damaged in various ways, psychologically damaged through, I guess, forms of abuse or neglect, or they're chemically, I guess, damaged through forms of abuse, or physically damaged through, I guess, forms of disorder, physical ailments, those can compromise a person's ability to see their self-interest, to think clearly, to make decisions, to reason in certain ways. But I don't think we want to define the system by those places where the system broke down. I think what we want to see is that people are somewhat autonomous agents once necessary and sufficient conditions have been built in. So once a person acquires something like speech and literacy, at this point, they're radically responsible for themselves in a way that a person who doesn't have either of those capacities, that once you've learned to talk, you're really responsible in some way. Once you've become literate, that is now amplified so many fold. You are capacitated in certain ways that it's hard to deny. Now again, still setting that within the context of assuming that there aren't some sort of other breakdowns or deficits that occur. Okay, so a person has a growing sense of self-awareness. See, I think this is how you can start to account for things like feelings of guilt. So if a person does something that they know isn't in their self-interest, they may feel guilt about it. But if they do something that is really different than they've been doing in the past, they may not feel guilt about it. See, now that's interesting to me. When I look at some people who try to account for a fully hardline deterministic view, it's almost like they're left with, we're just sort of ping pong balls on water. Well, how do our emotions relate to that? It would seem like for the full hardline determinist position, consistency is the only issue. I've seen people make this argument that consistency is the issue, and then when you deviate from your normal pattern, that's when it'll feel like a moral break. But that doesn't seem right. Now, there's a sense in which it'll feel like a moral break, but sometimes you will feel like you're doing a moral good when you deviate from yourself, and you'll feel good about yourself. Other times you may feel like you've done something against what you see as in your own best interest, and you will feel it. You will feel guilt and shame and remorse. And so our feelings seem to be some way calibrated to our recognition of our own capacities for deliberation and our own capacities for forethought and for the kinds of anticipations of what's going to happen to us when we do what we do. So let's take someone who assumingly can think within somewhat reason, and they now are going to open up a bank account, and it's going to be online, and they have to pick a password for themselves. Now, do they decide what that password is? Okay, let's get at that. Now, there seems to be a sense in which we're going to say, I think, that the person decides on a password. Now, clearly, they're not going to come up with a password of something that they're unfamiliar with. So, there are probably people who could anticipate the likely password of people. Like, we know their histories, we know what their interests are, we know maybe a lot about them, and we could try to guess what their likely password would be. But there's another sense in which we say, well, that's what makes a password. A password is that person could keep it secret. Now, when they're picking their password, there is, on some various forms of online services, there is a little meter that tells you how strong your password is. And a person can decide to take that information or not. They can look at that and they go, it says that this is a weak password, but I don't care. Or they could say, well, this is a very strong password. Okay, it's sufficiently protected. My account is. Even there, though, you start to ask isn't a person deliberating over their self-interest? Aren't they thinking about making sure that they have a secured enough password? Now, you could say, well, does it matter? Well, I think it does. I think that they can be aware of the fact that there will be consequences if they don't carefully put one together. Now, some people will still not put together a good password. They'll put, the word password, whatever. And if you ask, what is that? Well, is it just laziness? Let me back up a little bit. I think part of it has to do with maybe the kinds of information that seem to bear upon how we think and feel about things. So say I say that a couple of people committed a horrible crime and they did just atrocious acts. I think you might say, well, let's catch those people and bring justice. But then if I say, you know what though, these people were actually abused as kids, and because they were abused as kids and they were actually kind of tortured as kids, this, needs to be taken into account. And then you say, really, were they? And you say, yeah, they were abused quite badly. And you say, And I say, but you know what? The night before, they had talked at length, and we actually have a recording of them talking about how much they're sure they're going to get away with it. And they pretty much have come up with a really great plan that's assured that even though they know they shouldn't, that they're really positive they're going to get away with it. It's like each time we get a new piece of information, we think about it differently. And that, I think, is really interesting. The more that a person recognizes the degree to which different pieces of information get used differently, I think that is what partly throws this problem into how people are accounting for their actions and why there is potentially a psychoanalytic, there's a need, I guess, for psychoanalysis in people's account for the degree to which people are free or determined. That people are very easily serving a kind of self-interest, maybe a narrow self-interest, but a self-interest nonetheless, whether that's making a career for themselves by writing books in the name of various of these arguments, or trying to motivate themselves to do things, or trying to let themselves off the hook for things they've already done, but to deny that there's something going on in our language is, I think, to really miss a lot of it. And let me just end with this notion from Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke has so many great ideas related to this, and I'll see if I can post a link down to some of the previous videos of his distinction is between action and motion. And he would say, get out of the agency or the free will determinism discussion and move to action and motion. And what's the difference? And is there action? And what do we mean by action rather than just motion? And some of this, I guess, applies to theater and to drama and to the multiple framings that can go on. So if I'm watching a series of actions on stage, those actions are more than merely motions, because I can watch people kiss and fight, but it's really not a kiss or really not a fight. It's somehow meaning a kiss and a fight, but not that. Okay, but one of the things that Burke says is that he says part of the problem with it, the arguments are that there's always going to be a continuous relation of events from neighboring events, such that it will always be the case at some level that motion being what it is, things always are what they are as a result of what they've been. And I mean, things sort of flow out of that. But the problem is when you account for why something is to be from where something was, you have a little bit of wiggle room every time. Because the space between two events can be open through discourse, and take the tiniest little differences of because of, in spite of, or regardless of. Some person could say, well, I did X because of Y. I could say, I did X in spite of Y. I did X regardless of Y. And the more that people realize that those little changes are operative at any point in the discourse, the more that we realize that there is a potentially powerful kind of agency that needs like a depth psychoanalysis if we're going to get at a lot of what's really going on when people want to haggle about why people are free or why people are determined. Okay, thanks.